Throughout the series of Wario video games, it hasn't exactly been super ripe for the spin-off in its limited iterations. There was the Wario's Woods and Mario and Wario puzzle games, and the WarioWare thing that spun off to now be Wario's main form of remembrance among fans. But it mostly centered on its Wario Land platformer roots. Sometimes an unexpected spin-off can breathe new life into a franchise, or help to strangle the life out of it. Today's case to be judged is Wario Master of Disguise, a Metroidvania game that someone decided just needed that added Wario charm to really get it to where it needed to be. The Wikipedia article on the game lacks a development portion, so I'm not sure who was the one who was being the pushers for this game. If you haven't heard of the game, then don't feel too bad because it was developed by a company named Suzak, a relatively untested group of vigilantes who Nintendo picked up from the parking lot outside the Japanese version of GameStop. Unfortunately, the company is now bankrupt, and it wasn't hard to see why. Suzak mainly built puzzle, rhythm, and racing games for handheld devices, which isn't exactly a great business plan, as many have found out through the DS's lifespan of 30 million years. But Nintendo did allow the company to make the two handheld F-Zero games, so you can either judge their 2012 demise on those games, this one, or the horrible 2012 feature film. To be fair to Suzak, if they needed something to help beef up their investor portfolio, then honestly, this game would be the project to put front and center. Instead of just reading up on Nintendo Handheld's treatment of the IP and make yet another half-baked sort of exploration platformer, they decided to not only dedicate themselves to a blue-blooded Metroidvania style, but also decided to make the game amazingly plot-heavy in comparison to those games. It isn't overtly ridiculous a la Resident Evil 2 or 4, but it is definitely aiming for a bit of that B-movie charm. The deal is that the game starts with Wario sitting at home and scrolling through network TV and picking his nose while the narrator decides to be self-aware about what a lazy bones Wario is being until he randomly stumbles upon the Silver Zephyr show. Trust me, this is definitely going somewhere. Wario watches around a half episode of the show and decides that the Silver Zephyr is a douche nozzle who is undeserving of his awesome thievery powers, and then forms a plan to unseat him from his cosmic abilities. During the second half of the same episode, Wario goes off to his closet and builds a helmet of ultimate technology that allows Wario to teleport himself into the Silver Zephyr TV show and steal his powers, and then go on all the heists that he can imagine. For such a premise, the guys at Suzak dove headfirst into this idea, and it ended up better written than it had any right to be. It stumbles here and there, but the characters such as Wario and Cannoli, the true identity of the Silver Zephyr, along with good style and all the bit players are well-rounded, and are provided with a humorous script that builds up the ultimate threat, the bigger goal, and the rivalry between Wario and Cannoli that boils over several times throughout the game's runtime. The game does have an underlying mystery in it, as you could tell from a couple vague details in the narrative, and while the game tries to be tight-lipped about it, once you can see that the game has some fog in it, you can definitely make a pretty good guess at what it's going for, and the answer is so cliched that you're pretty much going to be right as long as you've seen 10 movies in your total lifetime. I'm not going to fault the game too much for being not clever enough, since the game is being campy, second-rate TV show in its styling, and the character interactions do build into that charm well enough to sustain enough of a hook to get a player through the 10 hours of content the game has. While the dialogue is nice to have, what you are mostly going to be doing in the game is exploring and solving the levels, of which Master of Disguise has quite a few of them. Probably around 12 to 16 fully fledged levels, which are each rich enough in tricks and puzzles to give you that true sense of the Metroidvania design they were going for. You explore the level, you gain new abilities, you beat up monsters, and then bully them later with your upgraded abilities. After the intro of the game, Wario acquires Good Style, the magic wand that provided Cannoli with the Silver Zephyr abilities, and after Good Style bestows Wario with the same abilities, he becomes the charismatic charmer, the Purple Wind, silent but deadly. Yes, I'm being serious. The Thief form is Wario's default ability that provides him with average abilities and a quicker movement speed. Throughout the game, Wario will be unlocking more costumes through good style and collectibles that gives him more abilities to explore further and punch harder. A glaring issue in the game trying to be a Metroidvania is that a sizable number of unlocks are so unwieldy and obtuse that they become equal to contextual QTEs, only being useful to bring out during gameplay when you find puzzles that were specifically designed for them to unlock, rather than each ability having some designed in-game utility to regular movement and combat. The Scientist form is an ability that gives the player additional sight to see hidden objects and enemies, which is frankly something I find very bullshit in terms of design, because the Scientist has no other use beyond that until fully upgraded. And since the Scientist is one of the slower forms, making his only use in the game the ability to see things that Suzak made totally invisible is the game being a massive cheat. But one of the worst offenders is the Artist form, which allows Wario to generate platforms, an incredibly useful ability that should have more powers, but the massive con to this form is that it can't move, which is spectacularly irritating. If you put the Artist in a place where you need to put blocks, then you need to move the Artist by going into another form and then starting the whole box stacking all over again. Think of the Iron Boots in Ocarina of Time, and that's basically what you have there. One of the other forms is the Captain form, which is only useful in water levels, which barely ever come up, and the Captain can't actually leave water. So when you finish the water puzzle you're doing, you then have to switch to another form to leave the area and move on to the next puzzle. And I won't blame you if you think I'm being anal level nitpicky here, but I'm actually not, and that's because one of the more bizarre creator choices that Suzak made that bit him in the ass in a multitude of ways, and one sin that more than one hired cowboy has made while working for quirky as hell Nintendo, is that they indulged the hardware gimmicks. Master of Disguise requires so much fiddling with the touchpad that it even rivals Mario Party DS for causing stylus-related carpal tunnel syndrome, and why my mouse cursor has been so prevalent in my emulated footage that I have for this video. First off, in order to change forms in the game, you have to draw a shape on Wario to change into that form. The problem is that with 8 different forms to pick from, the shapes had to become incredibly complicated, and the Nintendo DS does not work with complicated anything. So let's say, in a boss fight where the pressure is high and it requires several form changes, being hamstrung by a boss fight timing moment because you changed into the electric form while going for the dragon form is so beyond annoying that you end up forming a strategy to counter the damned hardware gimmick instead of the boss itself. Like, the mechanic was so badly implemented that I have to start using my limited brain cells fighting the handheld itself along with the boss? That's a whole thing the player has to deal with, but that's not even the worst part. What really takes the cake is that in the spirit of the old Wario games, Master of Disguise has tons, and I mean literal tons, of constant minigames that all involve the stylus to complete. Some games make you trace a convoluted shape, others make you drag things, you have to color a drawing under a time limit, you have to drag a circle through a maze. The whole idea is repetitive, tiring, and frankly an obstacle to the game you are trying to play because there's so many of these chests found throughout the game that require the mini-games to be unlocked that it's dumbfounding that Suzak thought that this was a good idea when they had nowhere near the creative drive necessary to fill out probably 70 to 80 chests worth of mini-games. And what makes this all worse is that there is no punishment for failing the mini-games other than having to redo it. So the game is literally filled to the breaking point with pointless busy work like a bad adventure game multiplied by 5. And then by metrics not known to mankind, Suzak was also able to make this worse because the minigames actually had a difficulty curve, and the familiar requirements to beat them would start getting worse later down the line. More complicated shapes, faster speeds, less time on the clock. Some of the chests contain the new forms and upgrades, and other chests contain completionist treasures with no ability to differentiate between the two, so you end up having to do every chest that you find to make it through the game. It makes me wish that the Master of Disguise would have stuck to his level-based puzzles, because badly made party game bull crap can make any game look incredibly tacky and unsavory. Of course, the actual levels and boss fights don't get away from this look as well, since a couple moments in the game harken back to Wario Land 3's tradition of stupidly obtuse puzzle design and logic failures that'll have you flitting around the unfound areas of the map, hopping up and down in multiple disguises in impotent fury. So, it's a bit of a wonky game, but while others balked at the game and told people not to buy it, I'm here to give it a tentative recommendation for cheap purchase or emulation, because while the game has its obvious flaws, the surprising humor, creative ingenuity, and the solid plotline does make this game one to remember as a quirky spin-off from the untested developer. Very shortly after the game's first couple levels, Wario and Cannoli learn of an artifact called the Wish Stone that was broken into several pieces that you have to put back together because video games, and while this is happening, Cannoli is frequently butting into Wario's plot to gather the Wish Stone and become ultimate greed master of the universe, and having boss fights with him and giant robots, or adding more puzzles to the level, or generally being a useless tool bag who's only full of bluster. Along with that, Wario runs into a small cast of suave thieves and magical creatures who give him wisdom and strife throughout his journey in finding the shards. Wario even runs into a strange little girl halfway through the game that supports him in a couple spots throughout, but we never figure out what her actual intentions are. As we're getting closer and reading a bit into the backstory of the Wish Stone, it seems that things are getting a bit more muddy than we first realized. But after taming the final level's traps and bringing the Wish Stone shards together to the eventual ritual place, it's revealed that, yeah, you pretty much guessed it, someone trapped the ultimate evil in the Wish Stone and scrawled a stupidly complex warning on it that got lost in centuries lost translation. The girl that was following Wario around turned out to be Tiara Misu, your run-of-the-mill, kill-everybody-for-no-reason demon who turns into such an arduous multi-stage boss fight that this was the point I ended up starting to use the artist's ability to draw health items into existence. But if you thought that me complaining about the form-switching drawings were bad, the artist's health regen ability seems to be deliberately designed to not work most of the time, and ends up misinterpreting my heart shapes as constant gibberish until randomly working 1 out of the 9 times. With the demon defeated and resealed in the Wish Stone and things with Count Cannoli have been wrapped up nicely, Wario is finally rewarded with the treasure he was seeking the whole time, provided by the transmogrified Good Style, who turned out to be the original ancestor of the Cannoli clan, a group of people who originally dedicated themselves to defending the Wish Stone shards, and also the guy who should have handed down the legend better, since Count Cannoli here didn't realize this for a damned long time. Wario gets the Cannoli treasure and finally leaves the TV show this entire story happened in, only to find that the treasure was entirely fictional, and therefore was returned to the fictional Count Cannoli. It's that classic Wario ending that makes this a consistent franchise. Master of Disguise is easily comparable to Metal Gear Acid for me, a somewhat baffling experience with a spin-off that changed up massive ideas in the formula, threw it through a totally different gameplay style, and came out the other side with something doofy that I found a lot of enjoyable charm within in spite of its glaring and massive problems. They do definitely hamper the game overall, and the whole thing could have been refined and threw out large portions of the original design document to make the game faster, less irritating, with more concrete gameplay and less busy work. fixed up the controls, and generally make the game more user-friendly, but the existence of both games' great plot lines and solid characters and dialogue do make an argument for this game being a hidden gem among the clutter, because it at least tried to do something new and more than just once or twice did land square on its feet and dazzled the DS audience with something special. I'm not going to fault you for not liking it, just like with Metal Gear Acid, but for what it was able to bring to the table, I would recommend at least checking it out. If you can get past the first 2 or 3 levels, then you should be okay to getting to the actual ending, since it's just more of the same game. Thanks for joining me on this route to the scoreboard. And I'll leave you all with a Purple Wind branded victory for gamers. Catch us next week for more ludicrous spin-offs.